Well, we're certainly close. And I'll talk just a moment. Excuse me, my goodness. It's Wednesday. It's now, I think, 6 o'clock, which means it's time for Tales and Cocktails. My dears, tonight I want to give you another short story by the wonderful Somerset Maugham. And let me remind you of who he was. He was born in 1874. Couldn't be 1874, of course, and died in 1965. He was among the most popular of writers in his era and reputedly the highest paid author in the 30s. Now, he had many, many short stories turned into movies, and as we said, the highest paid, but I can't emphasize how very popular he was, with good reason. Now, both of his parents died before he was 10, and he was raised by a paternal uncle who was extremely emotionally cold. Now, the early death of his mother, when he was 8, left him traumatized, and he kept her picture by his bedside for the rest of his life. He did not want to become a lawyer like the other men in his family, so he trained and qualified as a physician. Now, his first novel, Liza of Lambeth, sold out so rapidly that Maugham gave up medicine to write full-time. During the First World War, he served with the Red Cross and in the ambulance corps, before being recruited in 1916 into the British Secret Intelligence Service. He worked for that service in Switzerland and Russia before the October Revolution in 1917, and during and after the war he traveled in India, Southwest Asia, and the Pacific. He drew from these experiences in his short stories and in his novels. Now, among his books are Of Human Bondage, which was made into a film, we know, The Razor's Edge, also made into a film, The Moon and Sixpence, which became part of another series of films, and The Painted Veil. So let's just get on with it. This is Somerset Maugham and his facility with words, his invention, his imagination, his understanding of people and their motivations for their actions, to me is quite astonishing. So this short story by Somerset Maugham is entitled The Happy Couple. I don't know that I very much liked Landon. He was a member of a club I belonged to, and I had often sat next to him at lunch. He was a judge at the Old Bailey, and it was through him I was able to get a privileged seat in court when there was an interesting trial that I wanted to attend. He was an imposing figure on the bench, in his great full-bottomed wig, his red robes, and his ermine tippet, and with his long white face, thin lips, and pale blue eyes, a somewhat terrifying one. He was just, but harsh, and sometimes it made me uncomfortable to hear the bitter scolding he gave a convicted prisoner whom he was about to sentence to a long term of imprisonment. But his acid humor at the lunch table and his willingness to discuss the cases he had tried made him sufficiently good company for me to disregard the slight malaise I felt in his presence. I asked him once whether he did not feel a certain uneasiness of mind after he had sent a man to the gallows. He smiled as he sipped his glass of port. Not at all. The man's had a fair trial. I've summed up as fairly as I could, and the jury has found him guilty. When I condemn him to death, I sentence him to a punishment he richly deserves. And when the court rises, I put the case out of my head. Nobody but a sentimental fool would do anything else. I knew he liked to talk to me, but I never thought he looked upon me as anything but a club acquaintance. So I was not a little surprised when one day I received a telegram from him saying that he was spending his vacation in the Riviera and would like to stay with me for 2 or 3 days on his way to Italy. I wired that I should be very glad to see him, but it was with a certain trepidation that I met him at the station. On the day of his arrival, to help me out, I asked Miss Gray, a neighbor and an old friend of mine, to dinner. She was of mature age, but charming, and she had a flow of lively conversation which I knew nothing could discourage. I gave them a very good dinner, and though I had no port to offer the judge, I was able to provide him with a good bottle of Montrachet and an even better bottle of Mouton Rothschild. He enjoyed them both, and I was glad of that, because when I had offered him a cocktail, he had refused with indignation. I have never understood, he said, how people presumably civilized can indulge in a habit that is not only barbarous, but disgusting. I may state that this did not deter Miss Gray and me from having a couple of dry martinis, though it was with impatience and distaste that he watched us drink them. But the dinner was a success. The good wine and Miss Gray's sprightly chatter combined to give Landon a geniality I had never before seen in him. It was plain to me that, notwithstanding his austere appearance, he liked feminine society, and Miss Gray, in a becoming dress, with her neat head only just touched with gray, and her delicate features, her sparkling eyes, was still alluring. After dinner, the judge, with some old brandy still further to mellow him, let himself go, and for a couple of hours held us entranced while he told us of celebrated trials in which he had been concerned. I was not surprised, therefore, when Miss Gray asked us to lunch with her next day. Landon, even before I could answer, accepted with alacrity. "A very nice woman," he said when she had left us, "and a head on her shoulders. She must have been very pretty as a girl. She's not bad now. Why isn't she married?" "She always says nobody asked her." "Stuff and nonsense. Women ought to marry. Too many of these women about who want their independence. I have no patience with them." Miss Gray lived in a little house facing the sea at Saint-Jean, which is a couple of miles from my own house at Cap Ferrat. We drove down next day at 1 and were shown into her sitting room. "I have a surprise for you," she said to me as we shook hands. "The Craigs are coming." "You've got to know them at last." "Well, I thought it was too absurd that we should live next door to one another and bathe from the same beach every day and not speak. So I forced myself on them, and they've promised to come to lunch today. I wanted you to meet them, to see what you make of them." She turned to Landon. "I hope you don't mind." But he was on his best behavior. "I'm sure I should be delighted to meet any friends of yours, Miss Gray," he said. "But they're not friends of mine. I've seen a lot of them, but I never spoke to them till yesterday. It'll be a treat for them to meet an author and a celebrated judge." I had heard a good deal of the Craigs from Miss Gray during the previous 3 weeks. They had taken the cottage next to hers, and at first she feared they would be a nuisance. She liked her own company and did not want to be bothered with the trivialities of social intercourse. But she very quickly discovered that the Craigs were as plainly disinclined to strike up an acquaintance with her as she was with them. though in that little place they could not but meet 2 or 3 times a day, the Craigs never by so much as a glance gave an indication they had ever seen her before. Miss Gray told me she thought it very tactful of them to make no attempt to intrude upon her privacy, but I had an idea that she was not affronted, a little puzzled rather, that they apparently wanted to know her as little as she wanted to know them. I had guessed some time before that she would not be able to resist making the first advance. On one occasion while we were walking, we passed them, and I was able to have a good look at them. Craig was a handsome man with a red, honest face, a gray mustache, and a thick, strong gray hair. He held himself well, and there was a bluff heartiness of manner about him that suggested a broker who had retired on a handsome fortune. His wife was a woman hard of visage, tall and of masculine appearance, with dull, fair hair, too elaborately dressed, a large nose, a large mouth, and a weather-beaten skin. She was not only plain, but grim. Her clothes, pretty, flimsy, and graceful, sat oddly upon her. They would better have suited a girl of 18, and Mrs. Craig was certainly 40. Miss Gray told me they were well cut and expensive. I thought he looked commonplace and she disagreeable, and I told Miss Gray she was lucky that they were obviously disposed to keep themselves to themselves. "There's something rather sweet about them," she answered. "What?" "They love one another, and they adore the baby." For they had a child that was not more than a year old, and from this Miss Gray had concluded that they had not long been married. She liked to watch them with their baby. A nurse took it out every morning in a pram, but before this, father and mother spent an ecstatic quarter of an hour teaching it to walk. They stood a few yards apart and urged the child to flounder from one to the other, and each time it tumbled into the parental arms, it was lifted up and rapturously embraced. And when finally it was tucked up in the smart pram, they hung over it with charming baby talk and watched it out of sight as though they couldn't bear to let it go. Miss Gray used often to see them walking up and down the lawn of their garden, arm in arm. And it warmed her heart to observe the affection which that dour, unsympathetic woman so obviously felt for her tall, handsome husband. It was a pretty sight to see Mrs. Craig brush an invisible speck of dust off his coat, and Miss Gray was convinced that she purposely made holes in his socks in order to have the pleasure of darning them. And it looked as though he loved her as much as she loved him. Every now and then he would give her a glance, and she would look up at him and smile. Their mutual devotion was particularly touching because they were no longer young. I never knew why Miss Gray never married. I felt as certain as the judge that she had had plenty of chances, and I asked myself when she talked to me about the Craigs whether the sight of this matrimonial felicity didn't give her a slight pang. I suppose complete happiness is very rare in this world. But these two people seemed to enjoy it. And it may be that Miss Gray was so strangely interested in them only because she could not quite suppress the feeling in her heart that by remaining single, she had missed something. Because she didn't know what their first names were, she called them Edwin and Angelina. She made up a story about them. She told it to me one day, and when I ridiculed it, she was quite short with me. This, as far as I can remember, is how it went. They had fallen in love with one another years before, perhaps 20 years, when Angelina, a young girl then, had the fresh grace of her teens, and Edwin was a brave youth setting out joyously on the journey of life. And since the gods, who do not bother their heads with practical matters, neither Edwin nor Angelina had a penny. It was impossible for them to marry, but they had courage, hope, and confidence. Edwin made his mind to go out to South America or Malaya or wherever you like, make his fortune, and return to marry the girl who had patiently waited for him. It couldn't take more than 2 or 3 years, 5 at the utmost. And what is that when you are 20 and the whole of life is before you? Meanwhile, of course, Angelina would live with her widowed mother. But things didn't pan out according to schedule. Edwin found it more difficult than he had expected to make a fortune. In fact, he found it hard to earn enough money to keep body and soul together. And only Angelina's love and her tender letters gave him the heart to continue the struggle. At the end of 5 years, he would willingly, excuse me, let's go back. At the end of 5 years, he was not much better off than when he started. Angelina would willingly have joined him and shared his poverty, but it was impossible for her to leave her mother, bedridden as she was, poor thing. And there was nothing for them to do but have patience. And as the years passed slowly, and Edwin's hair grew gray, and Angelina became grim and haggard, hers was the harder lot, for she could do nothing but wait. The cruel glass showed such charms as she had possessed, slipping away from her one by one, and at last she discovered that youth, with a mocking laugh and a pirouette, had left her for good. Her sweetness turned sour from long tending a querulous invalid. Her mind was narrowed by the society of the small town in which she lived. Her friends married and had children, but she remained a prisoner to duty. She wondered if Edwin still loved her. She wondered if he would ever come back. She often despaired. 10 years went by, and 15, and 20. Then Edwin wrote to say that his affairs were settled and he had made enough money for them to live upon in comfort, and if she was still willing to marry him, he would return at once. By a merciful interposition of Providence, Angelina's mother chose that very moment to abandon a world in which she had made herself a thorough nuisance. But when, after so long a separation, they met, Angelina saw with dismay that Edwin was as young as ever. It's true, his hair was gray, but it infinitely became him. He had always been good-looking, but now he was a very handsome man in the flower of his age. She felt as old as the hills. She was conscious of her narrowness, her terrible provincialism, compared with the breadth he had acquired by his long sojourn in foreign countries. He was gay and breezy as of old, but her spirit was crushed. The bitterness of life had warped her soul. It seemed monstrous to bind that alert and active man to her by a promise 20 years old, and she offered him his release. He went deathly pale. "Don't you care for me any more?" he cried brokenly. And she realized on a sudden, oh, the rapture, oh, the relief, that to him she was just the same as she had ever been. He had thought of her always as she was. Her portrait had been, as it were, stamped on his heart, so that now, when the real woman stood before him, she was to him still 18. So they were married. "I don't believe a word of it," I said, when Miss Gray had brought her story to its happy ending. "I insist on your believing it," she said. I'm convinced it's true, and I haven't the smallest doubt that they'll live happily together to a ripe old age." Then she made a remark that I thought rather shrewd. "Their love is founded on an illusion, perhaps, but since it has to them all the appearance of reality, what does it matter?" While I have told you this idyllic story of Miss Grey's invention, the three of us, our hostess, Landon, and myself, waited for the Craigs to come. Have you ever noticed that people, if they live next door to you, are invariably late? Miss Grey asked the judge. "No, I haven't," he answered acidly. "I'm always punctual myself, and I expect other people to be punctual." "I suppose it's no good offering you a cocktail?" "None whatever, madam. But I have some sherry that they tell me isn't bad." The judge took the bottle out of her hands and looked at the label. A faint smile broke on his thin lips. "This is a civilized drink, Miss Grey. With your permission, I will help myself. I never knew a woman yet who knew how to pour out a glass of wine. One should hold a woman by the waist, but a bottle by the neck." While he was sipping the old sherry with every sign of satisfaction, Miss Grey glanced out of the window. "Oh, that's why the Craigs are late. They were waiting for the baby to come back." I followed her eyes and saw that the nurse had just pushed the pram past Miss Grey's house on her way home. Craig took the baby out of the pram and lifted it high in the air. The baby, trying to tug at his mustache, crowed gleefully. Mrs. Craig stood by watching, and the smile on her face made her harsh features almost pleasant. The window was open, and we heard her speak. "Come along, darling," she said. "We're late." He put the baby back in the pram, and they came up to the door of Miss Grey's house and rang the bell. The maid showed them in. They shook hands with Miss Grey, and because I was standing near, she introduced me to them. Then she turned to the judge. "And this is Sir Edward Landon, Mr. and Mrs. Craig." One would have expected the judge to move forward with an outstretched hand, but he remained stock still. He put his eyeglass up to his eye, the eyeglass that I had on more than one occasion seen him use with devastating effect in court, and stared at the newcomers. "Gosh, what a dirty customer," I said to myself. He let the glass drop from his eye. "How do you do?" he said. "Am I mistaken in thinking that we've met before?" The question turned my eyes to the Craigs. They stood side by side, close to one another, as though they had drawn together for mutual protection. They did not speak. Mrs. Craig looked terrified. Craig's red face was darkened by a purple flush, and his eyes appeared almost to start out of his head, but that only lasted a second. "I don't think so," he said in a rich, deep voice. "Of course, I've heard of you, Sir Edward." "More people know Tom Fool than Tom Fool knows," said he. Miss Grey, meanwhile, had been giving the cocktail shaker a shake, and now she handed cocktails to her two guests. She had noticed nothing. I didn't know what it all meant. In fact, I wasn't sure it meant anything. The incident, if incident there was, passed so quickly that I was half inclined to think that I had read into the stranger's momentary embarrassment on being introduced to a celebrated man something for which there was no foundation. I set about making myself pleasant. I asked them how they liked the Riviera and if they were comfortable in their house. Miss Grey joined in, and we chatted, as one does with strangers, of commonplace things. They talked easily and pleasantly. Mrs. Craig said how much they enjoyed the bathing and complained of the difficulty of getting fish at the seaside. I was aware that the judge did not join in the conversation, but looked down at his feet as though he was unconscious of the company. Lunch was announced. We went into the dining room. We were only 5, and it was a small round table, so the conversation could not be anything but general. I must confess that it was carried on chiefly by Miss Grey and myself. The judge was silent, but he often was, for he was a moody creature, and I paid no attention. I noticed that he ate the omelet with good appetite, and when it was passed around again, took a second helping. The Craigs struck me as a little shy, but that didn't surprise me. And as the second course was produced, they began to talk more freely. It didn't strike me that they were very amusing people. They didn't seem interested in very much besides their baby, the vagaries of the 2 Italian maids they had, and an occasional flutter at Monte Carlo. And I couldn't help thinking that Miss Grey had erred in making their acquaintance. Then, suddenly, something happened. Craig rose abruptly from his chair and fell headlong to the floor. We jumped up. Mrs. Craig threw herself down over her husband and took his head in her hands. "It's all right, George," she cried in an agonized tone. "It's all right." "Put his head down," I said. "He's only fainted." I felt his pulse and could feel nothing. I said he had fainted, but I wasn't sure it wasn't a stroke. He was the sort of heavy, plethoric man who might easily have one. Miss Grey dipped her napkin into water and dabbed his forehead. Mrs. Craig seemed distraught. Then I noticed that Landon had remained quietly sitting in his chair. "If he's fainted, you're not helping him to recover by crowding round him," he said acidly. Mrs. Craig turned her head and gave him a look of bitter hatred. "I'll ring up the doctor," said Miss Grey. "No, I don't think that's necessary," I said. "He's coming to." I could feel his pulse growing stronger, and in a minute or two he opened his eyes. He gasped when he realized what had happened and tried to struggle to his feet. "Don't move," I said. "Lie still a little longer." I got him to drink a glass of brandy, and the color came back to his face. "I feel all right now," he said. "We'll get you into the next room, and you can lie on the sofa for a bit." "No, I'd sooner go home. It's only a step." He got up from the floor. "Yes, let's go back," said Mrs. Craig. She turned to Miss Grey. "I'm so sorry. He's never done anything like this before." They were determined to go. And I thought myself it was the best thing for them to do. Put him to bed and keep him there, and he'll be as right as rain tomorrow. Mrs. Craig took one of his arms, and I took the other. Miss Grey opened the door, and though still a bit shaky, he was able to walk. When we arrived at the Craigs' home, I offered to go in and help undress him, but they would neither of them hear of it. I went back to Miss Grey's and found them at dessert. "I wonder why he fainted," Miss Grey was saying. "All the windows are open, and it's not particularly hot today." "I wonder," said the judge. I noticed that his thin, pale face bore an expression of some complacency. We had our coffee, and then, since the judge and I were going to play golf, we got into the car and drove up the hill to my house. "How did Miss Grey get to know those people?" Landon asked me. "They struck me as rather second-rate. I shouldn't have thought they were very much her mark. You know women. She likes her privacy, and when they settled in next door, she was quite decided that she wouldn't have anything to do with them. But when she discovered that they didn't want to have anything to do with her, She couldn't rest till she made their acquaintance. I told him the story she had invented about her neighbors. He listened with an expressionless face. "I'm afraid your friend Miss Gray is a sentimental donkey, my dear fellow," he said, when I had come to an end. "I tell you, women ought to marry. She'd soon have had all that nonsense knocked out of her if she'd had half a dozen brats." "What do you know about the Craigs?" I asked. He gave me a frigid glance. Why should I know anything about them? I thought they were very ordinary people." I wish I knew how to describe the strong impression he gave me, both by the glacial austerity of his look and by the rasping finality of his tone, that he was not prepared to say anything more. We finished the drive in silence. Landon was well on in his 60s, and he was the kind of golfer who never hits a long ball, but is never off the straight, and he was a deadly putter. So, though he gave me strokes, he beat me handsomely. After dinner, I took him in to Monte Carlo, where he finished the evening by winning a couple of £1,000 at the roulette table. These successive events put him into a remarkably good humor. "A very pleasant day," he said, when we parted for the night. "I thoroughly enjoyed it." I spent the next morning at work, and we did not meet till lunch. We were just finishing when I was called to the telephone. When I came back, my guest was drinking a second cup of coffee. "That was Miss Gray," I said. "Oh, what had she to say?" "The Craigs have done a bolt. They disappeared last night. The maids live in the village, and when they came this morning, they found the house empty. They'd skipped, the Craigs, the nurse, and the baby, and taken their luggage with them. They left money on the table for the maids' wages, the rent to the end of their tenancy, and the tradesmen's bills." The judge said nothing. He took a cigar from the box, examined it carefully, and then lit it with deliberation. "What have you got to say about that?" I asked. "My dear fellow, are you obliged to use these American phrases? Isn't English good enough for you?" "Is that an American phrase? It expresses exactly what I mean. You can't imagine I'm such a fool as not to have noticed that you and the Craigs have met before, and if they vanished into thin air like figments of the imagination, it's a fairly reasonable conclusion that the circumstances under which you met were not altogether pleasant." The judge gave a little chuckle, and there was a twinkle in his cold blue eyes. "That was a very good brandy you gave me last night," he said. "It's against my principles to drink liqueurs after lunch, but it's a very dull man who allows his principles to enslave him, and for once, I think I should enjoy one." I sent for the brandy and watched the judge while he poured himself out a generous measure. He took a sip with obvious satisfaction. "Do you remember the Wingford murder?" he asked me. "No." "Perhaps you weren't in England at the time. Pity. You might have come to the trial. You'd have enjoyed it. It caused a lot of excitement. The papers were full of it. Miss Wingford was a rich spinster of mature age who lived in the country with a companion. She was a healthy woman for her age, and when she died rather suddenly, her friends were surprised. Her physician, a fellow called Brandon, signed the certificate, and she was duly buried. The will was read, and it appeared she had left everything she had, something between £60,000 and £70,000, to her companion. The relations were very sore, but there was nothing they could do about it. The will had been drawn up by her lawyer and witnessed by his clerk and Dr. Brandon. But Miss Wingford had a maid who had been with her for 30 years and had always understood that she would be remembered in the will. She claimed that Miss Wingford had promised to leave her well provided for, and when she found that she wasn't even mentioned, she flew into a passion. She told the nephew and the 2 nieces, who had come down for the funeral, that she was sure Miss Wingford had been poisoned. And she said if they didn't go to the police, she'd go herself. Well, they didn't do that, but they went to see Dr. Brandon. He laughed. He said that Miss Wingford had had a weak heart, and he had been treating her for years. She died just as he had always expected her to die, peacefully in her sleep, and he advised them not to pay any attention to what the maid said. She had always hated the companion, a Miss Starling, and been jealous of her. Dr. Brandon was highly respected. He had been Miss Wingford's doctor for a long time, and the 2 nieces, who had stayed with her often, knew him well. He was not profiting by the will, and there seemed no reason to doubt his word. So the family thought there was nothing to do but make the best of a bad job and went back to London. But the maid went on talking. She talked so much that at last the police, much against their will, I must admit, were obliged to take notice, and an order to exhume the body was made. There was an inquest, and it was found that Miss Wingford had died from an overdose of veronal. The coroner's jury found that it had been administered by Miss Starling, and she was arrested. A detective was sent down from Scotland Yard, and he got together some unexpected evidence. It appeared that there had been a good deal of gossip about Miss Starling and Dr. Brandon. They'd been seen a lot together in places in which there was no reason for them to be together, except that they wanted to be together. And the general impression in the village was that they were only waiting for Miss Wingford to die to get married. That put a very different complexion on the case. To make a long story short, the police got enough evidence in their opinion to justify them in arresting the doctor and charging him and Miss Starling with the murder of the old lady. The judge took another sip of brandy. The case came up for trial before me. The case for the prosecution was that the accused were madly in love with one another and had done the poor old lady to death so that they could carry on the fortune Miss Starling had wheedled her employer into leaving her. Miss Wingford always had a cup of cocoa before she went to bed, which Miss Starling prepared for her, and the counsel for the prosecution claimed that it was in this that Miss Starling had dissolved the tablets that caused Miss Wingford's death. The accused elected to give evidence on their own behalf, and they made a miserable showing in the witness box. They lied their heads off. The witnesses testified they had seen them walking together at night with their arms round each other's waists. Though Brandon's maid testified she had seen them kissing one another in the doctor's house. They swore they were no more than friends. And oddly enough, medical evidence proved that Miss Starling was Virgo intacta. Brandon admitted that he had given Miss Wingford a bottle of veronal tablets because she complained of sleeplessness, but declared he had warned her never to take more than one, and then only when absolutely necessary. The defense sought to prove that she had taken the tablets either by accident or because she wanted to commit suicide. That didn't hold water for a moment. Miss Wingford was a jolly, normal old lady who thoroughly enjoyed life, and her death occurred 2 days before the expected arrival of an old friend for a week's visit. She hadn't complained to the maid of sleeping badly. In fact, her maid always thought her a very good sleeper. It was impossible to believe that she had accidentally taken a sufficient number of tablets to kill herself. Personally, I had no doubt that it was a put-up job between the doctor and the companion. The motive was obvious and sufficient. I summed up, and I hope summed up fairly. But it was my duty to put the facts before the jury. And to my mind, the facts were damning. The jury filed out. I don't suppose you know that when you are sitting on the bench, you somehow get the feeling of the court. You have to be on your guard against it to be sure it doesn't influence you. I never had it more strongly than on that day that there wasn't a soul in court who wasn't convinced that those two people had committed the crime with which they were charged. I haven't the shadow of a doubt that the jury would bring in a verdict of guilty. Juries are incalculable. They were out for 3 hours, and when they came back, I knew at once that I was mistaken. In a murder case, when a jury is going to bring in a verdict of guilty, they won't look at the prisoner. They look away. I noticed that 3 or 4 of the jurymen glanced at the 2 prisoners in the dock. They brought in a verdict of not guilty. The real names of Mr. and Mrs. Craig are Dr. and Mrs. Brandon. I'm just as certain as I am that I'm sitting here that they committed between them a cruel and heartless murder and richly deserve to be hanged. What do you think made the jury find them not guilty? I've asked myself that, and do you know the only explanation that I can give? The fact that it was conclusively proved that they had never been lovers. And if you come to think of it, that's one of the most curious features of the whole case. That woman was prepared to commit murder to get the man she loved, but she wasn't prepared to have an illicit love affair with him. Human nature is very odd, isn't it? Very, said Landon, helping himself to another glass of brandy. And that is The Happy Couple by Somerset Maugham. I love his stories. He is such a consummate storyteller. Yes, and I have to be careful not to try to do too many of his in a row, but I'll get another one in sometime later. So that is Tales and Cocktails for tonight, my dears. Thank you very much for joining me. Join me again a week from tonight for another Tales and Cocktails. Thank you and good night.